the Ukrainian troops have managed to pile on into the northeast front line, and they are managing to peg back the Russians. There's an intense amount of street fighting that's going on in Vovchansk. And so whilst Russia did make territorial gains, there was a huge amount of concern across Ukraine that those gains that they were getting were essentially eliminating what they managed to achieve 2 years ago when Russia first made that incursion. That they have managed to peg them back to some degree, and that's been seen as a success for Ukraine.
Now, at least 11 people have been killed and dozens injured in a Russian airstrike on a supermarket in the northern Ukrainian city of Kharkiv. President Volodymyr Zelensky has said more than 200 staff and shoppers could have been inside the store when it was struck by 2 glide bombs. Maxim Tucker reports on Ukraine for The Times.
In Kharkiv, there was a horrendous Russian bombing attack on a crowded shopping centre on a Saturday afternoon. Some 60 people are believed to have been wounded at this time. 17 people are missing. The city centre was also attacked with rocket fire at the same time. Given that this is Ukraine's second largest city, I think it is extremely alarming for Ukrainians to see some of the gains that were made in the counteroffensive of the early months of the war starting to possibly be reversed, and certainly the Russians take the initiative in bombing major towns and cities once more.
Well, that's Maxim Tucker, who reports on Ukraine for The Times. Let's speak to Paul Sims, who is The Sun's senior correspondent in Kharkiv. Morning, Paul.
Morning.
Just give us a sense of what it is like in Kharkiv at the moment. And I mean, I was reading just on Thursday, there were 15 strikes in a single day. Just give us a sense of what it's like there.
It's just relentless. The bombing campaign from the Russians happens morning, noon and night on a daily basis. We're getting alerts through every hour from threats of missile attacks, the glider bombs. It is just non-stop. So you've got the front line over towards Vovchansk and Lipsy, where the intense fighting is taking place, where Russia pushed through over the border in a bid to try and make some territorial gains. They've been pegged back, but in the meantime, Russia is launching this aerial blitz on Kharkiv city. So if I take you back a few days, on Thursday, they struck a printing press. It's not a military target. This is a civilian premises where people were working. There were 50 people there on Thursday. Of the 50, 7 people were killed. A further 16 were wounded. We had more attacks over the days that followed. And then yesterday, in possibly the single most deadliest strike on Kharkiv, the second largest city since the start of the war, happened. And just to give you a quick update, the death toll has since risen to 12. We've got at least 43 others wounded. And as Zelensky said, and also the city mayor, they believe that 200 people were inside the epicenter DIY store, which is it's the equivalent of B&Q in the UK. It's a huge building. It's about 10,000 meters square foot. Sorry, 10,000 square foot in size. And when I spoke to witnesses, we arrived a few minutes later. When I spoke to witnesses there, there was no one coming out. They don't believe there are any survivors. So I expect that death toll to rise significantly in the coming hours.
Gosh. I was also reading about one of the horrendous tactics that the Russians are using at the moment is the tactic of bombing somewhere, and then as the rescue workers go in to try and help, they bomb again.
It's known as a double tap. So what the Russians do, if I can give you an example, on the printing presses on Thursday, they fired an S-300 surface-to-air missile. They strike an area just before the printing presses. That causes pandemonium. People begin to run. Emergency services head towards the scene, and then they fire in the second S-300 missile so that they can cause and create the greatest amount of casualties and kill the most amount of people. It's frightening being here, but this is something that Ukrainian people live through and have lived through for every day for the last 2 years.
Mm-hmm. I mean, I guess this really underlines the concerns that the Ukrainians have, and President Zelensky has outlined many times before about the lack of air defences.
Yeah, he made the point yesterday. So whilst he described this attack yesterday on the DIY centre as a manifestation of Russian madness. It also underlines what he's trying to argue, that the air defences across Ukraine just aren't sufficient to deal with this constant aerial bombardment from Russia. He's made repeated pleas, and he did it again yesterday, for Western allies to step up to the mark. I mean, we saw, didn't we, with the US military aid package being delayed. As a result of that delay, the window of opportunity opened up across the border on May the 10th, which gave Putin that ability to send his troops across the border, not necessarily unopposed, but they certainly didn't face as severe a fight back as they would have done had Ukraine been properly armed.
Are you getting a sense that Russia is growing in confidence, particularly in the region you're in?
If you'd asked me that question a week ago, I would probably have said yes. But in the days that have followed, Ukrainian military forces have managed to redeploy towards the northeastern Kharkiv. Essentially, what Russia's doing is stretching the front line, and by stretching the front line, they stretch the Ukrainian armed forces. But the Ukrainian troops have managed to pile on into the northeast front line, and they are managing to peg back the Russians. There's an intense amount of street fighting that's going on in Vovchansk. And so whilst Russia did make territorial gains, there was a huge amount of concern across Ukraine that those gains that they were getting were essentially eliminating what they managed to achieve 2 years ago when Russia first made that incursion. That they have managed to peg them back to some degree, and that's been seen as a success for Ukraine. But obviously the days will follow, and we'll see what happens. But it's a very, very volatile situation, and it's growing in intensity. And I think Russia is just going to constantly bombard the area, and because they are being pegged back so much on the ground, I think the aerial blitzes, the missile attacks, will just grow.
Paul, thank you so much for speaking to us today, and stay safe.
Thank you.
That is Paul Sims. He is the Sun's senior correspondent, speaking to us from Kharkiv. And it really I think it really brings it home. You know, there's always a worry, isn't there? There's a sense of war fatigue, that people say, oh gosh, you know, the Ukrainian war, it's been going on so long. We hear the headlines in the newspapers and we hear it on the radio. And maybe it doesn't kind of affect us in the same ways it did in the early stages of the war. But for Paul to turn around and say that the bombing yesterday of the DIY store was effectively like bombing B&Q.
Yeah.
And there were around
Brings it
200
home.
staff and customers in there. It just gives you a real sense of what Ukrainians are living with day in, day out. And that's why it's really important we continue to bring all of the details to you here on Times Radio.
Absolutely right. And it just trying to live their lives in a war zone.